How Does the Science Biology, and I'm Mrs. Bolden, and today we're going to talk about chromosomal mutations, the last part of our molecular genetics series. Okay, so we talked about DNA mutations, and um, they usually involve a single protein or a part of a protein um, that isn't being made. And don't get me wrong, that's not like a great thing if it's a protein that you need to survive and you no longer have the DNA for that. So that's a problem. A bigger problem is when we have chromosomal mutations. And this is really big because it's big pieces of the chromosome, or maybe even multiple copies of a single chromosome, which will have like huge effects. Oh my gosh, there it all is right there. So there are two types of chromosomal mutations. The first type is a change in the structure of the chromosome. Now remember, just snipping off a piece of an arm of one of the chromosomes, that's like basically getting rid of a whole chunk of DNA, which might be hundreds, if not thousands, of different recipes for proteins. So that's kind of a big piece to be missing. So a deletion is when part of a chromosome is lost. An insertion is when you add a piece of chromosome on there. Sometimes, like when they are in the chromatin form and then they condense into chromosomes, sometimes they stick together. A translocation is kind of an interesting one because a piece of one chromosome gets traded with a piece of a non-homologous chromosome. So usually crossing over happens between homologous chromosomes. This is when like a piece of the number 5 chromosome gets stuck on number 3, and you say, well, all the DNA is still there. Yes, true, but it's kind of like if you misplace a book in the Boston Public Library. The Boston Public Library is literally an entire city block. It's huge. They have millions of books, and if you move one of the books and put it back in the wrong place, they may never be able to find it again. So when the Boston Public Library looks for a book, there's a call number on the book, and then they run around and they go and find the book, and it has to be in the spot where it's supposed to be. Same kind of thing happens with your DNA. When your DNA needs to make a particular protein, that protein, the recipe for that protein is on a very particular place on a chromosome. And if it's supposed to be on the short arm of the number 5 chromosome, and the short arm of the number 5 chromosome isn't there, it's stuck on the short arm, stuck on the number 3 chromosome, the cell doesn't have that DNA. It isn't in the right place. And even though it's somewhere, it's not where it's supposed to be, so that protein can't be made. So these are like really huge deals when it comes to how it affects the offspring. So you can also, another type of mutation could be a change in the number of chromosomes. Now we talked that gametes traditionally, or in humans, have 23 chromosomes, and so Sparky the sperm and Olivia ovum, each with 23 chromosomes, get together and they make an individual with 46 chromosomes. That's awesome. Sometimes there's something called non-disjunction happens when they're paired up. Sometimes one chromosome sticks to its homologous partner when they're supposed to be pulled apart. They don't get pulled apart, so one gamete ends up with 2 copies of the same chromosome, while the other gamete that's produced doesn't have a copy of that. So one egg might have 24 chromosomes because it has 2 21s, and then another gamete might only have 22 chromosomes because it doesn't have a 21. So this happens because they don't separate during meiosis. So you can end up with a couple of things. You can end up with a trisomy when the Sparky, the sperm, and Olivia ovum get together. If the egg has 24 chromosomes, It might have two number 22 chromosomes, and then Sparky the sperm arrives with his 21st chromosome. So now we have three copies of the 21st chromosome. That's called a trisomy. Tri because it's three. So that ends up with three of one type in the gamete, and this usually has pretty huge repercussions. Another situation could happen when an egg that's missing a chromosome altogether ends up being fertilized by a sperm that has another chromosome, has that chromosome, so now they only have one, so that's called a monosomy. Before we go on to polyploidy, there's some pretty famous trisomies out there. Trisomy 21, which I kind of talked a little bit about. That's Down syndrome, people who have Down syndrome. There's some very specific characteristics that go along with Down syndrome, and they're all related back to the fact that it has three copies of the 21st chromosome. There's a syndrome out there called monosomy. No, not monosomy. It's Turner syndrome. And what happens with Turner syndrome is an egg that doesn't have an X chromosome gets fertilized by a sperm that has an X chromosome. So instead of having it has just one X chromosome, doesn't have a Y, doesn't have another X. So that's monosomy 23. So for each chromosome, there's like a syndrome that goes along with it, like trisomy 21 is Down syndrome. And these usually have huge repercussions for the organism. Just like if you've probably met people that have Down syndrome, and there's usually some mental retardation that goes on. There's usually, they have a short stature. Sometimes they have like a trident shaped hand a little bit. Their eyes tend to be a little bit different. All of that is related to the fact that they have an extra 21st chromosome. So kind of interesting with that. Polyploidy is not something that happens in humans. Polyploidy is not just when you have an extra chromosome, you have an extra whole set of chromosomes. When that happens in humans, the zygote doesn't develop. So it just, it kind of goes, ah! And then dies because it's too much information. Polyploidy does not occur in most organisms successfully. It's kind of like a big warning flag, like woo 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 woo, too much DNA, and it kind of gets rid of the zygote that was produced by that. But it does actually occur in some organisms. Triploid is when you have three sets of chromosomes. Tetraploid is when you have four sets of chromosomes, and this doesn't, again, it doesn't happen in people. It does happen in some plants. If you've ever seen, like, probably late July, early August on the side of the road, you have those orange lilies. They're called tiger lilies. That's just one example of that type of lily. But people who breed lilies, they try to get them, because plants can be polyploidy, and usually when you breed two regular plants together, sometimes you can get a triploid or a tetraploid offspring, and usually the offspring that are polyploidy usually have exaggerated traits, like their colors are more intense, or they're hardier, or they have, they smell better, or something that's just like exaggeration of the traits. So polyploidy does actually occur mostly in plants, although there are a couple of species of fish, I think, maybe goldfish or something, I can't remember, but not really in higher order animals at all, but mostly in plants. So let's talk about two different types of mutations. If a mutation happens in a body cell, what's the result? If it happens in a gamete cell, what's the result? So a body cell mutation is only going to affect the individual that has the body cell. So if you end up with skin cancer, that is a mutation that happened in a body cell. It's not going to be passed on to the offspring because it's not your body cells that make offspring. It's a gamete cell. If there's a mutation in the body cell, it only affects the individual with the mutation, does not affect its offspring. So body cell mutations could cause cancer. They could, cause cancer, or they could not cause cancer. There's a lot of the DNA that's actually nonsense, like the parts that code for something are there. The parts that don't code for something, there can be a mutation in that part, and it's not going to affect the body cell DNA at all. Of course, if you expose yourself to more and more mutagens, as happens during your lifetime, because DNA damage is cumulative, builds up over time, you're increasing your chance that it's not necessarily going to happen in one of the nonsense parts of the DNA. It could more likely happen in the part of the DNA that codes for something. So it could potentially cause cancer. A gamete mutation isn't going to affect the individual that is producing the gamete, because it's only a change in the gamete DNA. That has nothing to do with like your skin cells or your liver cells or anything like that. However, because it's in the gamete DNA, and that if that change gets passed on to the offspring, every cell in the offspring is going to have that change. So when we're talking about triploidy, when we're talking about trisomy, there's a much higher incidence of trisomy 21 or Down syndrome when mothers have been older when they have their children. Not necessarily always, it's not 100%, but the chance increases like after 30, 35, 40, and later it really goes up quite high. So because those eggs have been there since the beginning, since the girl was born, the eggs have been there, exposed to all kinds of mutagens through life, and it's cumulative. So there's a higher incidence that those eggs, which have been around for a long time, are going to have some damage to them, and that's going to affect, because it's only the set of chromosomes in the gamete that gets passed on to the next generation. But the next generation grows from that original set of chromosomes that comes from mom and the original set that comes from dad. Sperm is not, it's perfectly capable of having mutations in it as well, but because sperm is made on a regular basis, it isn't like been around for years and years and years. So it's more likely that if there's a mutation, usually it comes from the gamete mutation is usually going to come from the female, because she's been exposed to mutagens for a lot longer than the male has with the sperm. Okay, well, that's it for molecular genetics. Thanks for joining me. Have a great day.